Hi, this is Joseph. Welcome back. We are now in Chapter 6, Propositional Logic. Today we're going to be covering a mini lecture on 6.1, Symbols and Translation. So if you're following along and you're not in my class, we're using Hurley's 13th edition, his Introduction to Logic. And if you're following along in my class, I'm going to set you up for either working through the book or mind tap, doesn't matter which one. So we will just start. If you're in my mind tap class, just to let you know, outside of my videos, you also have Chapter 6 videos. You have a whole section, 6.1, 6.5, 6.6, a lot of them. And then disjunction, conjunction, implication. So a lot of these down here are going to cover what I cover, but individually, okay? So feel free to use these videos as well, unless you just want to use mine. It's up to you. Nevertheless, here we go. So 6.1. So chapter 6, all about taking English statements that are propositions about reality. And what that looks like is things states of affairs either obtain or they don't obtain. They're either true and false. Like right now I'm sitting down recording this lecture. It's a statement about reality. It's true. So in this section or this chapter overall, you're going to be learning a different language, symbolic logic. Basically, you're going to be translating English sentences, which are English statements. You're going to be translating them into their simplest form. So you're going to take simple statements, use a letter to symbolize, and then you're going to use logical operators, and we'll get into those. So in section 6.1, you're going to learn 5 symbols, and you're going to translate, okay? So that's the bottom line. What I'm going to do is take you straight to your homework, just so you could see what examples you'll have, and then we'll go back and unpack a little bit through each section, okay? So in your homeworks, mind tap might look a little different from the book or vice versa, but either way, you know what kind of homework's coming at you in this section. So what we'll do, there's a simple statement right here. I'll read it to you. Cartier does not make cheap watches. Okay, so what we're going to learn about, and there's a bunch of statements, right? And you're going to have to translate these using symbols. Like you're looking at this. What in the world am I looking at, right? Well, we'll find out. This is a wedge. This is a horseshoe. And these letters represent simple statements. So by the time you're done with my minute lecture, you'll be able to come through here and pretty easily see, how to do this. But I'm taking you here first. So statement 1, Cartier does not make cheap watches. This right here is a simple statement. And we can symbolize this whole statement using one letter. And what I would suggest is taking the first word out of each one of these and then choosing the first letter of the word. So C for Cartier, right? So we'll say this whole thing equals C. And then inside of this, we'll see a keyword stand out, not. So we will say this whole thing equals C. Like basically, Cartier does not make cheap watches. We'll say that whole statement about reality, or that whole, sentence right there. We're just going to say that thing equals C. And then we're going to say, but says Cartier does not make cheap watches. So we'll say not C. The whole thing represents not C. Because again, the whole thing about this is we're translating sentences using symbols. Okay, so not C would be the answer. And I'm going to unpack how to do this in your homework. I'm just letting you know what's coming at you. So then while I'm lecturing your homework on how to do this, you, in the back of your mind, will say, oh yeah, he showed me an example of that. So let's see this one, number 2. Arizona has a national park, but Nebraska does not. Right here we have 2 simple statements, and they're separated by a key word, this word but. Let's look at 3. We have, either Stanford or Tulane has an architecture school. There's trigger words that stand out, either or. Number 4, both and. So it turns out this word and, this word or, they're going to be very key words, this word but. And they're going to have a certain symbol attached to them. And we'll see that those symbols mean that they're logical operators. And then what they're doing is separating two statements. We could call this whole statement right here, Arizona has a national park. We could call the whole thing A. But Nebraska does not. We'll call this whole thing N. So, in short, this one is A dot not N. A dot not N. What about 3? Either Stanford or Tulane has an architect school. So this word or divides both of these simple statements. And we'll say, this thing, how do we want to represent this whole thing? You could use any letter you want. But how about using the letter S, just because we have Stanford? So this whole thing, S or T for Tulane. So S or T. Turns out this or, we'll use a symbol. It'll be like a little V called a wedge. So we'll say SVT. SVT. So all these examples, we're going to see trigger words inside like and, or, but, if, then, if, and only, if. And we're going to find out that those have symbols attached to them, or that we're going to translate them as symbols. And then the simple statements, you can use any letter in the alphabet you want, but you're usually going to use the first letter of the first word. So that's kind of what's coming at you. Now let's start from the very beginning, okay? I do that in reverse fashion so that you can process in the back of your head what your homework might look like. So, and again, I don't cover every single bit of the reading. You can do that because I always expect you to read this either before or after listening to this video, because Hurley gives you a lot more detail than even I do. But I will read. So in this chapter, form recognition is facilitated through the introduction of special symbols called operators or connectives. We're going to learn about it. There's 5 of them in this section, okay? 5 operators. When arguments are expressed in terms of these symbols, determining validity often becomes a matter of mere visual inspection. So the whole point of this chapter, and even of this section, is to take complex sentences and translate them and simplify them into very simple symbols, and then the statements themselves will represent by letters. When we keep them in their simplistic form, for example, like this whole thing up here, we can determine validity real fast. So up here, Hurley gives us an example of simple statements. Number 1, fast food tends to be unhealthy. How can we represent this whole thing with one letter? Choose any letter you want. This whole thing equals or is represented by what? F. This whole thing means F, right? What about this one? James Joyce wrote Ulysses. How can we symbolize this in one letter? Pick one. I'll pick J. Any of you pick U? It's fine too. How about this one? Parakeets are colorful birds. Represent that whole thing with one letter. P, right? And then this one. Represent it with one letter. Maybe B or T, whatever you want. These are simple statements. A statement is either true or false, and it represents something about reality. Okay? And we're going to simplify this by using one letter. Down here, we have compound statements. In other words, we have 2 statements, and what separates them is going to be something called a logical operator. Sounds complicated, but watch. First one. It is not the case that Al-Qaeda is a humanitarian organization. So this is compound because we have one statement, but then inside of it we have one operator, not. Ah, there it is. So we have not. So this whole thing could be represented as what letter? What do you want to use? It is not the case that Al-Qaeda is humanitarian. So down here, Hurley represents that whole thing as A. Right? And he says it's not the case that A. Because it says it's not the case that blah, blah, blah. And he uses A for Al-Qaeda. What about this one? Diane Reeves sings jazz and Christina Aguilera sings pop. This guy right here, this word and, is separating 2 simple statements. This one we could call D and C. D and C. See how easy that is? That's basically your homework. Either people get serious about conservation or energy prices will skyrocket. So right here we have an or separating 2 simple statements. So One simple statement, people get serious about conservation. How do you want to symbolize that? P. How about this one? Or energy price will skyrocket? E. So either P or E. Either people get serious about or energy price will. So we're taking these we're taking these compound statements, which are sentences. We're looking for key words that separate them, which we're going to find out are called logical operators, and then we're going to substitute a letter for each simple statement. So let's do this one. If sperm, oh my gosh, said sperm. Yeah. If nations spurn international law, then future wars are guaranteed. So we have an if, then. So this if, then, we'll find out, is a trigger for, hey, I got two simple statements, if, then separates them. And so what do we want to call this whole thing right here? If, n. If, n, then whatever you want to use. Hurley uses F. So if n, then F. And then down here, the Broncos will win if and only if they run the ball. The Broncos will win, E. If and only if, R, run the ball. So we're taking English, we're simplifying it. It turns out you could simplify it even more. We could drop the it's not the case that, and we can give a symbol to represent that, which is tilde. We'll see in a second. We could drop the and and give it a dot. We can drop the either or and put a wedge there. We can drop the if then and put a horseshoe, and we can drop the if and only if and put a symbol. So what we're doing is we're taking this, we're simplifying it. We're taking this and simplifying it even more and using symbols. Okay, so that's the evolution of the chapter. Bottom line, 5 symbols, what they are called, what their function is inside of these compound statements, and what are they translating? Meaning, what kind of keyword, what kind of trigger words am I looking at to give it a certain symbol, right? So, for example, when I see not, I don't give it a triple bar. I give it a tilde. When I see or, I don't give it a dot. I give it a V. So, you're looking at certain language in a sentence or statement or compound statements. You're looking for certain trigger words, and then you know exactly what symbol to use, okay? And then you know what function it has. So that's the bottom line of the chapter. And again, this is going to build up into 6.2, 6.3, 6.4, 6.5, 6.6. By the time you're done with this chapter, you will be a walking logical robot. No, I'm just kidding. So this is like building blocks of a new language you're learning. Right now, you're learning a new language, propositional logic. And what you're figuring out is right from the beginning, okay, I have to take sentences, which are compound statements or simple statements about reality. Like Joseph said, I got the English. And I'm going to translate them, giving them a letter. I'm going to substitute them with a letter. Then, if they're separated by logical operators, I'm going to give them their logical operator, whatever it is. Then, I can put it in its most simplest form, whatever it looks like, right? I will use this later to determine whether statements are true and false, whether arguments are valid or invalid. So again, that will come later in this chapter. But for now, we just want to simplify the English that we're using. Okay, so let's go down. Let's see if I missed anything. Yeah, just for review. In propositional logic, however, okay. So what we learned in chapter 1 and chapter 2, we talked a lot about terms, and a term is the main subject of a sentence. And if something's a main subject of a sentence, we want to know, like, what does it mean? How is it defined? Chapter 2 is all about that. Like, where do we get our definitions from? What are their criteria? And what kinds of definitions there are, for those terms? Well, in chapter 6, we're not worried about the terms as much as we are the propositions, the whole statement. And the whole statement itself can be symbolized into a letter and used later on to give us more information about the validity. So let's start. Again, we had our simple statements up here, compound statements here. We were translating some with a little bit of English left over. Then we see down here, we're going to find out we could just take that English, like the if and only if, and just, hey, instead of saying B if and only if, we'll say B triple bar R. See this if and only if right here? See it right there? Right, so see if and only if, you know that it's going to get this symbol. Not any of these other ones, just this. So we'll say B triple bar R. Why do I say triple bar? Because that's the name of this symbol. This one's a horseshoe. This one's a wedge. This one's a dot. This one's a tilde. Now we'll get into each one individually, okay? Seems like a lot, but it'll get easier. And again, those examples that you saw above, we took the English and we stripped it right out and just said, hey, we don't need it. We don't need it. Is not the case that. We'll simplify even that. We'll just say that thing is a tilde. What does it do? It negates. Negation. So anytime I see not is not the case that, I know I'm doing some sort of negation. Whatever something is, I'm going to negate it. It's not the case that that thing is true. It's not the case that that thing is. It's a negation. So down here, D and C, we know and means dot or wedge. Either P or E, we'll drop the either or. We'll just say P, wedge, E. So basically, these are saying the exact same things as these, except this is more simple. Okay? So think of 6.1 as simplicity. Take your English statements, simplify them to the most simple logical form, and that's going to look like one letter or two letters. If you have two letters, they're going to be separated by an operator. If you have one letter, it could just remain the same. Like I could just have A or B or X or whatever letter I want to use. And if it's alone, that's fine. For example, Joseph is sitting here in this chair lecturing to you right now. That can all be symbolized as J for Joseph, right? And it really is the case that I'm sitting here lecturing to you. If it was not the case, I would just say not J. Like not A, right? So, and that's kind of the pattern. So what Hurley does is he'll break this into a section, this, and this. He gives you multiple examples of how to translate. This right here, I highlighted. You don't need to worry about that. It's really technical language. So if you get confused about that, don't worry about it. I'll be explaining what to do in these sections. Okay, so for the first one, we're going to talk about the tildes. Just the tildes. We're going to negate stuff. So Hurley, in each section that you see, these purple sentences, he's trying to say, hey, here's a bunch of examples on how to do this one part. So for example, this section is all about the horseshoe. This section's all about the wedge. And this section's all about the dot. This section's all about the tildes. And again, if you don't know what those are, okay, the tilde is all about negation. The dot is about conjunction, bringing two things together. The wedge is also bringing two things together in a different way. It's called disjunction. The horseshoe is about implication. If you have something, then something else follows. Or these are known as conditionals also. Some people say horseshoes, some people say conditionals. We'll go with what Hurley says, horseshoes. This one's triple bar. That just means equivalence. It's a very strong relationship between two conditionals. But so again, you have a symbol. You come up here and you know what the symbol's doing. You know what its logical function is. One symbol's negating. Another symbol's bringing something together in a certain way. Same with this one. So look back up here to find out what they're doing. And again, I'll get you by repetition. We are translating these English expressions. Okay? Then we're using logical operators. So we're going to see trigger words for these, which are all here. These are the trigger words. Now, on that note, before I start each section, Hurley, he always does this. Some chapters better than others, but he masterfully gives you a cheat sheet. You could take a picture of this while you're doing your homework, and he says, hey, anytime you see these very specific words inside of an English statement, and you want to symbolize them into their, or translate them into a logical form, you're going to use an operator symbol. So he says, all of this, you're going to use this. If you see, and, yet, but, however, moreover, nevertheless, still, also, you're going to use this, the dot, or the wedge. Whenever you see or either or unless, you're going to use this. Right here, the wedge, which is for a conjunction. This is for a conjunction. This is for the negation, right? Whenever you see if, then, only if, implies, given that, in case that, provided that, on the condition that, all these examples of the English, using a horseshoe. So, for example, if you see if, then, you're not going to use a dot. You're going to use horseshoe. Whenever you see if and only if together, triple bar. Whenever you see is sufficient, or sorry, is equivalent to, this. Whenever you see sufficient and necessary for, meaning they're both together, sufficient and necessary for, triple bar. Notice up here on the horseshoe symbol, we actually see necessary condition and we see sufficient condition. But notice that they're alone. They're separated by commas. They're not together. So if they're alone, we're looking at a horseshoe. When they're together, meaning if and only if, comma, or is equivalent to, or sufficient and necessary condition for. When they're together and how they're expressed, they're this. So I guess what I'm trying to say is this horseshoe will be a little tricky for some of you because you might look at some of this language and think it's this symbol, or you might look at this language and think it's that symbol. So get straight on these two. Okay, so now we're going to go up. And again, go back to that first homework example. We saw something about Cartier watches, right? Not the case. The whole thing was C, not C. Done. And then the other one was something about two things being together. We used a dot. It was like T dot A. Done. So now let's go to some examples. Rolex does not make computers. This whole thing could be translated as what letter? Hurley says R. Does not make. Okay, whenever I see that, I know it's a not. It's a negation. Rolex does not make, so not R. It's not the case that Rolex makes computers, or it's false that. Notice that all of these English expressions right here, all these statements, they're all translated the exact same way. So what we're just trying to get at in this chapter, what we're really trying to show you is that English is very flexible. We can say things 101 different ways using different words. Some of us are like more analytical, some more artistic, some both, right? We might express things differently. If somebody wanted to say something about negative about Rolex watches, they could say it 3 different ways. It still means the same thing. So it shows us we have a lot of flexibility in our language. But if we want to look at something logically or in its logical form, we're going to make it real simple. So yeah, all this says the same thing. It's simply not R. So he gives you examples. He just says, look, all these are negations. I got a negation here, 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 or I have tildes here, and it's negating everything after it. Negating that, negating this. Notice this not B, that's a simple statement. This not, parentheses G, horseshoe H, this is a compound statement. It's got a logical operator in between 2 simple statements. This is a compound statement and another compound statement. So it's like 2 compound statements. And they're in brackets, and we're negating everything inside the bracket. Think mathematics. Remember in mathematics when we had to solve equations like algebra, we would solve everything in the parentheses first, then we'd solve everything in the brackets, then we'd go outside the brackets. So that's kind of like an order of operation. So let's say later on in the chapters, if we were to solve this guy right here, we would do everything inside the parentheses first, and then whatever our answer is, we negate it. Okay. Main operator. And I already went over this, but the main operator is the operator that has as its scope everything else in the statement. So basically, if we look at all these, the main operator is the tilde. Again, if you're confused, these are all operators. And when we're looking at our examples, we just want to know what's the main one that we're looking at. So right there, what's the main operator here? That V, right? That little wedge. What's the main operator there? The horseshoe. What's the main operator here? Triple bar, right? It's the only operator in there. What's the main operator here? The tilde, or the negation. Yeah. So we got our first one done. Bunch of examples. This is how you would express it in its symbolic form. So we're done with the tilde. Moving on. We got 4 more to go, okay? Right. So the dot symbol is used to translate such conjunctions as and, also, but, however, yet, still, moreover, although, and nevertheless. All of those, when you see those words, you know that they're getting a dot or a wedge. And again, go back to the back of the chapter. He gives you a paragraph full of words, or even right here. So both of these are good. So let's do this one. Tiffany sells jewelry and Gucci sells cologne. How does he symbolize this? T. How does he symbolize this? G. Real simple. T dot G. Or T and G. Or, Tiffany and Gucci. Real easy, right? What about this one? Tiffany sells jewelry, but Gucci sells cologne. T dot G. Turns out these three right here, these symbolic forms, or these three English statements are all saying the exact same thing. Just different ways of saying it. So again, he's really showing you the flexibility of language that we have. Think chapter 2 with all these terms and definitions we use. Many of us will say things differently. We do all the time. For example, like I do frisbee golf with my son right now, or I teach him how to play chess. I could say, hey, Kai, let's go play chess. Or I could say, hey, Kai, let's go study chess problems. Or, hey, Kai, let's go play a game of chess today. I mean, all of those mean the same thing. I want to go do something chess-related with Kai. But it's all about chess. It's just three different ways of describing it. Or, hey, let's go frisbee golf. Or, hey, let's go down the street and throw some frisbees. Or, maybe we could play frisbee golf today. It's all saying the same thing. Just different ways of doing it. So the important thing in here, the important thing in this section and the important thing in these statements is how do you symbolize it with a letter? You could use any letter you want, but for me, I keep it stupid simple, and I take the first letter of the main word, so T for Tiffany. Or down here, Ben Bridges sell jewelry. I'll say that whole thing right there is B, so T and B. So you got to use letters. That's the first part, and then you got to find the logical operators, and, however, but, and, okay? And it gives you an example here. They're all conjunctions, meaning they all have a dot is the very main operator. Notice this one's crazy complex, right? But in the middle, the main operator, it's the very last thing we consider. It's a conjunction or the dot. Now we're on to wedges, okay? And he tells you, look, wherever we're going to translate or unless, things like that, and you can look at the back of the chapter or either or, we're going to use a wedge. So here, Aspen allows snowboards or Telluride does A or T or A VT. Look at this. All of these say the same thing. A VT. Guess what? 4 different ways of saying the exact same thing. You can look at these now. Either Aspen allows snowboards or Telluride does. And it turns out this T could be, the T and the A could be backwards. It's still the same truth function, meaning I have A or T, or I could have T or A. The reason he's doing it in this order is because we see the A first, right? So we put the A first. Later on, we'll find out in later subheadings of this chapter, we'll find out we could reverse the order. It doesn't matter. But for now, keep it stupid simple. Whatever you see first, put that first. So I got my wedges. It's a conjunction. It usually is either or. Or unless, all disjunctions. Main symbol here is the V again. Now we're on to the horseshoe symbol. If, then, only if, given that, provided that, on the condition that. There's a bunch of different ways, right? You can look at them right here, these different ways, or you can go to the back of the, and what do I mean by the back? This part. It's like a little cheat sheet. Right there. See, it kind of exhaust, like if, then, only if implies that, given that. See? He just summarizes it there really nice. You can take a picture of it and have it side by side while you're doing your homework. Let's go back up. You can read this. Gives you more detail. But now let's just dive in. If Purdue raises tuition, then so does Notre Dame. We have an if then. We know we're going to use a horseshoe symbol. P, N, PN. So this is tricky now because he's going to give you 6 examples, but notice sometimes you see the C comes first right here, for example. But over here, the C is translated last. What? Well, I'll explain that. So whenever you see if, you know that whatever comes right after the if is an antecedent. Now, for those of you that haven't followed along previous chapters, chapter 1, we talked about conditionals, part of the deductive arguments. And in the conditional, you'll always have an antecedent and a consequent. Turns out the word if is always triggering an antecedent. Then is always triggering a consequent. So anytime I have if, I know my antecedent's there. What does that mean? The antecedent goes to the left, the consequent goes to the right. So that one was simple, right? What about this? Notre Dame raises tuition if Purdue does. Now I have the if on the end of the sentence, where over here I have it on the beginning. So if I have it on the end, do I translate it on the end or the right side? No. If Purdue does, anything after the if is an antecedent. It means it always goes to the left. Remember, these are all conditionals. They're all horseshoes. And you have to figure out what goes to the left, what goes to the right. The antecedent goes to the left, consequent goes to the right. So again, if Purdue, I'm going to take my P, bring it over here. And these two sentences are saying the exact same thing, but in a different way. Why do we know they're saying the same thing? Because they're translated the same. What about this one? Purdue raises tuition only if Notre Dame does. So whenever I see the word only if, I know that whatever comes to the right literally comes to the right when I translate. Why? Because Notre Dame, we can make it an N, and we see an N over here. These two. Cornell cuts enrollment provided that Brown does. When I say provided that Brown does, I'm going to say B. So we'll say C, horseshoe B. Oh, doesn't work that way. It's B, horseshoe C. So whenever I see provided that, and I see whatever comes to the right, it turns out it goes to the left when you translate. You can see it with these two examples. Cornell cuts enrollment on the condition that. You think that when you see this, you would think when you come to it, you're going to translate it like C horseshoe B, right? When you look over here, it's reverse. It's B horseshoe C. So what you've got to do is look at the English on the condition that, or on condition that, or provided that. Whenever you see these specific English clause right here, you know that whatever comes to the right is actually going to be translated to the left. They're reversed, okay? So you don't have to memorize this, just look back to it. When you have a statement, figure out, what language am I using? Is it if then? Is it only if? Is it provided that? Is it on the condition that? And watch how Hurley translate it. You do it the same. What about this? Brown cutting employment implies that. So whatever's after implies that, which is a C, is literally right after that. So it looks like, okay, this is B horseshoe C, B horseshoe C. So here's the pattern. Right here, number 2, number 4, and number 5 get reversed. 2, 4, and 5 get reversed by the way that you read it. Number 1, number 3, and number 6 are as you read them. If Purdue raises tuition, so does Notre Dame. So you can take notes there. So 2, 4, and 5, as we read them, they're reversed when we translate them. Meaning Cornell does not come first and Brown does not come last. It turns out Brown comes first and Cornell comes last. So, and it has everything to do with this guy right here. So when we see on the condition that, and we know that Brown's the antecedent, this is just like saying if. So provided that or on the condition that would just be the same thing as we're saying if. So if, provided that on the condition that, have the same pattern, okay? So those are the harder ones and the horseshoe ones. You just have to pay attention to those English. So again, main operators, conditionals, sufficient and necessary. So this section right here seems a little harder, but it's kind of simple. So you remember in chapter 1, we talked about necessary and sufficient conditions, like drinking lemonade is a sufficient condition for quenching thirst. And it turns out there's other conditions that you can think of for quenching thirst. You know, like you could drink water, you could drink a beer, you could drink all kinds of stuff, Gatorade. They're all sufficient, right? They all count as instances of satisfying some other thing. And the necessary condition, like in order to play racquetball, it's necessary for me to have a racket. In other words, it's needed. So when you see sufficient, necessary, those are going to be related to these conditionals. And what Hurley's trying to say is, well, how do you know if this is necessary or this is sufficient? Like, how would you know how to do it? And he says, real simple. I'm giving you a mnemonic. It's called SUN. Sufficient, necessary. And he says, see that U? Turn it to the side and it's a horseshoe. Ah. So whenever you see a horseshoe or a conditional like this, right? Whenever you see this, right here, the antecedent, it's always the sufficient condition. And to the right-hand side is always the necessary condition, okay? That'll come in handy as you're working through some of these problems. So again, it's not rocket science. These are sufficient. These are necessary. In other words, this is not necessary and this is not sufficient. This is sufficient. This is necessary. So he just says, look at that mnemonic. It'll help you. Okay. So now let's go on to my triple bars. Last one. Whenever you see if and only if or is sufficient and necessary condition for, those are going to trigger a triple bar symbol or a biconditional. And so he symbolizes JFK, Titan security, if and only if. Oh, here it is. So J, triple bar O. J, triple bar O. And then this one here, different ways of saying the same thing, is sufficient and necessary condition for. Again, this is the simplest form that these two are translated in. And these are different ways of saying this, which is the same. So, they're called biconditionals. And there's the triple bar or the biconditional, main operator of each one. And then Hurley gets a little wild here, and in your homework you might see this. He's going to say there's some compound statements that have two operators. And it gives you a whole list of English, right? You got to pay attention to the commas and then where you put parentheses. So, for example, when you read this, you know that you've got and you know that you've got or. Well, you know those are two logical operators, right? You know you're going to have a dot and you're going to have a wedge, right? Well, where the hey do I put the parentheses? Do I put them here or do I put them after the A and the Z? Like, how do I know? Well, the comma kind of helps you. So let's look at what Hurley does. Prozac relieves depression and Allegra combats allergies, comma, or Zocor lowers cholesterol. So Prozac relieves depression and Allegra combats allergies. That whole thing is P dot A in parentheses, and then the comma signifies another operator coming at you, or Zoloc. So look at all these. Look at where the commas are in the parentheses. It's a little fancy down here. We'll do the horseshoe one. If Mark challenges its logo, then if Pfizer increases sales, then they will organize. So if Mark changes its logo, we know if is going to represent a horseshoe. Well, then he puts a comma there and he says, then if. So you know that this whole thing right here is the consequent, and this little guy right here is the antecedent. So that's why he's saying then if. You're like, what? That's confusing. No, he's trying to say then there's a whole other consequent coming, but then inside of it is an antecedent and a consequent. So that's why he's got to put the parentheses there. So when you see the then if, don't get confused because he says then if, and then another then comes. So if P, then L. So P, then L. And all that was separated by that first comma, okay? So look at those. He's going to use a couple different symbols at you with parentheses. And then here's another example of negations. These are all kinds of examples of, does he negate and use parentheses? Or does he negate and not use parentheses? So for example, right here we have a negation and another negation, and here we have a negation and parentheses. You got to figure out like which one am I using? We'll just look at his examples. Pay attention to either or both, or not either. So whenever you see not either or not either, you know right away that's going to be a negation and parentheses. What about neither Megan nor? So whenever I see neither nor, I know I'm going to have parentheses. What about not both? Not both, Megan. Parentheses. And then you can look at the other ones for not the parentheses. And he gives you the more simplistic cheat sheet right here. So whenever I see not either, not, I'm going to have parentheses, not either. What about either not or not? Whenever I see it that way, I'm not going to have parentheses. See that? What about not both? Whenever I see not both, tilde, parentheses. So he's just going a layer deeper. He's going to use two logical operators here. And here he's going to use negations, but you have to figure out, are there negations with or without a parentheses, okay? Leibniz, you don't have to worry about him. Really smart guy, though. Really smart guy. Massive contribution of logic. I'm not sure about that wig, bro. But anyways, really smart guy. You could not dig on his wig, but as far as logic, you got to dig on it. All right. Well-formed and not well-formed formulas. Looks like a lot. Real easy. So not well-formed means something's not right. Again, this chapter was like simplifying statements, right? You're going to use letters and you're going to use logical operators. So not well-formed, you can't have two letters side by side. You have to have something in the middle of them. You can't have a letter on the outside of a parentheses. You've got to have a letter with an operator on the outside of the parentheses. So right here on the top part of, not well-formed or bad, the bottom one are well-formed or good. So let's do simple fifth grade language. Bad, good. Bad, good. Bad. Oh, there's no good. Bad, good, bad, good. Or let's do Trump language. Very good. Oh, sorry. Very, very bad. Very good. Very, very good. He talks like that. It makes me laugh. So there you go. So let's look at some examples. When you see a pattern like this, because this will be an example homework problem, notice here you're not translating. You're looked at something that's already been translated, and you're saying, look, does this jive well with Hurley, his rules? And you can look at how he explains them right here. Or this one. So we have an A, horseshoe B, that looks good. We have an A, wedge, negation B, that's good. We have an A dot, parentheses, that's good. What about this? On this one, the not well formed, you cannot have a negation after a letter. You have to have it before. So bad, good. What about this? A negation B. No. Turns out you can have an A and another operator like an A dot or an A horseshoe, not B, but you can't have just a not. For example, see this one? A horseshoe, not B, that's fine. Because you got a logical operator that separates the two, and then this operator negates that one. So you might say the only way you can have two operators side by side is to have the tilde to the right and another operator to the left. Where were we? But you can't have a tilde to the left and a main operator to the right. You can't do that. You can't negate an operator. But you can negate a simple statement. See, this negates that statement B, whatever B equals. For all you know, B equals badass, okay? So, whatever, it's negating that. But notice this is not negating the operator right there, that horseshoe. So, look at these examples. You can't negate a wedge, and you can't say not dot A. You got to have some other letter over here, which you don't have. And that's pretty much it. And there's your cheat sheet. Now, remember in the beginning when we went to the homework and some of you were like, what is going on? What is happening to me? Now, when we come to it, it looks much easier. You're going to take these examples. You're going to use letters to simplify, and then you're going to use an operator. So let's go back. Number one, Cartier does not make cheap watches. How do we symbolize this whole thing? C. We have a does not in here, so we say not C, right? Not C. Number two, Arizona has a national park, but Nebraska does not. What do we use for the but? What do we use? You got it, the dot. So this is a little tricky because we have A for Arizona has a national park, so we say A, right? We have A dot, and we have N for Nebraska. But notice the Nebraska says does not. So we actually have A dot tilde N, or not N, because the Nebraska is being negated. Tricky, huh? Let's do 3. Either Stanford or Tulane has an architectural school. So we have an either or. What symbol do we use? You got it. A wedge. And that's going to stand for disjunction. So we have either Stanford. What do we want to call that? What letter do you want to use? S? What about Tulane? What letter do we use for this? T. So we'll say S, wedge, T. S, wedge, T. What about this one? 4. Both Harvard and Baylor have medical schools. I'll give you a second. Try to give me the answer for that. How many of you said H dot B? If you did, you're right. H dot B. Real simple, right? H for Harvard, B for Baylor. H, and we know the and is a wedge symbol, so it's a dot symbol, and it's sorry, not a wedge. It's a dot, and we know it's a conjunction. I don't know why I said wedge. Okay, so real simple. First letter of the first word that stands out, Harvard. So we got H, we got B, we got boom. You know, and is a dot. There you go. Let's do this one, 5. If Chanel has roadward fragrance, comma, then so does wine. So we have an if then. What kind of symbol stands out in your mind? And how would you translate this? So how many of you said C, horseshoe, L? If you did, you're right. Now, if you said L, horseshoe, C, you're wrong. Because we know that if means that Chanel's the antecedent, that means that it goes to the left-hand side of that horseshoe symbol, okay? And what about, let's do 6. Chanel's roadwear fragrance if Levin does. Now, how do you translate this one? How many of you said L, horseshoe, C? If you did, you're right. Because we know L goes on the left-hand side. It's the antecedent. Why? Because the if always signifies the antecedent. Okay? And last but not least, let's do 7. Maureen Dowd writes incisive editorials if and only if Paul Grudman does. What stands out here, if and only if? What kind of symbol do you want to use? You got it. How many of you said M, triple bar, P? If you did, you're right. Could you use any letter you want? Yes. The bottom line with these is you get the symbols right. So for the first one, you got to have a not. For this one, you got to have a dot. For this one, you got to have a wedge. As long as you get those symbols right, you could use any letter you want. So for example, on this one, I could say D, triple bar, K if I want. But Joseph says keep it stupid simple and take the first main word, which is the M, and over here the first main word is the P, so M, P. So you could use any letter you want, but it's easier to be consistent with what you're seeing. So for example, number 8, Reese Witherspoon wins Best Actress only if. What letter would you use for this whole part right here? Yeah, like an R, right? Because it's the first word you see, Reese. So we'll make it an R. So that's kind of your homework. Whether you're using MindTap or the book, you have 5 logical operators. You know how to translate these simple statements or compound statements using letters. Put the main operator in there. And let's go to another part of the homework that you're going to see is the well-formed. If this comes up on your homework. Oh, and notice these, by the way, in section 2. This is so easy. Hurley says, hey, translate these. He literally gives you the letter. You cannot get that part wrong. He's like, look, R and F. Those are the only 2 letters you can use. And it turns out when you read it, unless we reduce the instant, you'll find out that, oh, yeah, R is for this one and F is for this one. So that's even easier. He's giving you the letters. You've got to find out now what symbol, what logical operator to use. But if you're not doing that section of the homework, you don't have to worry. Oh, yeah, look at this. He's giving you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Whew. 5 different letters. Wow. That means there's 5 simple statements going on in that one example. And you've got to like hash them all out. Okay, oh, I got a semicolon, stuff like that. I don't think any of you are going to have homework that difficult. All right, so let's go into well-formed, not well-formed. Let's try number 1. When you read this, does it look like everything jives pretty well? I have an S dot, not T. They're in parentheses. I have my main wedge out here. I got parentheses. Yeah, that's a well-formed formula. What about number 2? I got a negation on the outside. Am I allowed to do that? Yeah. I got a dot. Yeah, that's good. I got parentheses. That's good. I got a wedge before I have my G. Am I allowed to do that? No. So if you go up above, it turns out you have to have another simple statement letter before the horseshoe. You can't just have some horseshoe and then some letter. You have something before it. So it turns out that's not well formed. And what about 3? What about this part right here? Am I allowed to have that? A simple statement and a negation, another simple statement? No. I have to have a main operator before that. I can't just have 2 letters and a negation in between them. So those are some examples of your homework. And again, you have 5 logical operators. You have your cheat sheet right here with, what English am I going to use what triggers me with when I see this certain English over here, it's going to trigger me to use this symbol. Or if I see an or unless, I'm going to use this symbol and not these other ones, right? So this is a good cheat sheet. And we find out that in each section, he tells you, like let's say we're in the horseshoe section, right? He tells you if, only if. He goes through and he quotes only if. And he gives you a bunch of examples there. It's just that cheat sheet kind of keeps it simple. And again, let's go up here. The wedge symbol. He says, look, when you see or unless, that's when you're going to use it, okay? And then finally, we'll come back up here to the and operators. Where are they at? Let me see here. Yeah, the dot symbol. And also, but, however, yet, still, moreover, although, nevertheless, those very words, they will all be using a dot, okay? That's it. I know it was a lot, but I hope I've empowered you to understand the new language of propositional logic and to be able to use symbols and to translate English sentences, which are statements about reality, which are propositions about reality, into their most basic logical form, okay? And then when we get to 6.2, we'll find out that there's truth functions going on. But for now, this should be enough for you to complete your homework. And if you have any questions, just reach out to me.